This is AP European History and IB History Year 1 Review Podcast Number 2. The title of this podcast is Great Britain, Economy, Reform, and Imperialism from roughly 1660 until 1914. We will try to take this all the way up through the start of World War I, but if we run out of time, I think that it will be adequate. So, we have to start out in the 1660s when Britain's economy was largely based upon its exploitation of colonies through the policy of mercantilism. By the 1660s, in the reign of Charles II, England's American colonies in particular had begun to really blossom and develop into possible economic resources for Britain, and that was sort of the vision of what they were supposed to be. The policy of mercantilism involved maximizing the net transfer of wealth from those colonies to Britain, the mother country. And it did so by essentially assuring that the value of goods imported from the colonies was less, consistently less, than the value of goods exported to the colonies. So they would import relatively inexpensive, unfinished raw materials, and then they would export finished goods with value being added in that manufacturing process that was going on in Britain itself, led at that time by skilled laborers. But then eventually, as you get late into the 18th century and then certainly in the 19th century, that value was being added through the manufacturing process, the factory system, that kind of thing, but initially by skilled workers. So the idea then was to add value to what was being imported from the colonies and then export it as a more valuable finished good. And so there would be a net transfer of wealth from the colonies to the mother country, England. This was enforced by means of what was known as a series of laws called the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts prohibited the colonists, England's colonists, from trading with anyone but England. If the colonists had been allowed to do this, if they had been able to trade their raw materials to other countries, then England would have to bid for them. And that would drive up the price, and it would mean that England would find the whole venture less profitable. Similarly, the colonists, if they could trade freely with other countries, could purchase their finished goods from anyone. And then England, in order to compete, would have to reduce the prices of the finished goods that they were selling. And so that, again, would reduce the net transfer of wealth. So that's where England's economy was. It was very much a commerce-based economy, and not so much an internally based economy, but it was an economy that was directed outward and was very much focused on trade. Now, the trade was very much facilitated by the establishment of joint stock companies, and we mentioned those in the previous review session. These commercial ventures were very expensive and they were very risky, and generally speaking, one person was not willing to or not able to put up the total amount of wealth needed to finance a commercial venture. So joint stock companies invited investors to put up a portion of what was needed to carry forth the commercial venture. And what you do is, it was always easier to find 1,000 people willing to risk $100 than one person willing to risk $100,000. And so that's how a joint stock company worked. It was the first form of what we called a corporate financing. And those who bought into a company, those who helped make that initial investment, were then entitled, once the company became profitable, if it became profitable, they were then entitled to a share of the profits called a dividend. And when companies became profitable and began turning dividends then, persons who perhaps did not buy shares of stock initially, were now interested in doing so, and so they might approach persons who own stock in those profitable companies and see if they would be willing to sell them. And so there was this sort of secondary market for stock certificates, and that market was initially carried out in the Bank of London, but then it became such an avid market, and the stock jobbers, who were the people who made a living by putting together people who were willing to sell with people who were looking to buy, they were too rowdy, and so they end up having to reconvene in coffee houses like Jonathan's Coffee House, and then later on, eventually, a Royal Exchange is built for them. And so commerce, the commercial economy of Britain became became something that was profitable for the merchants themselves, but could become profitable for people who were willing to invest. And then could even become profitable for people who were in the business of stock jobbing, which is putting together buyers and sellers of stock. The internal economy of Great Britain really took off then in the 17th century. I'm sorry, in the late 17th century, but mostly in the 18th century, with the advent first of the agricultural revolution and then the industrial revolution, which continued and really blossomed in the 19th century. So the agricultural revolution is a process of transforming agricultural output by introducing new techniques and new technologies into the economy, or into the agricultural sector. And this kind of begins probably in the first half, really, of the 18th century, first half of the 1700s, with the advent, for example, of an addition to the system of crop rotation, which had existed since the Middle Ages. It was found, for example, that certain plants, like clover and legumes, actually fix nitrogen out of the air and then leave it in the soil. So they pull nitrogen out of the air. It was very abundant. They restore it into the soil. Now, in the old system of crop rotation, the only way that nitrogen was being restored into the soil was through grazing and pooping. You left a field fallow and you let your cattle graze, and then they would poop, and the poop would return the nitrogen into the soil. But this was an even more productive way of doing it, particularly if you planted legumes, because the legumes could also be harvested and were a food crop as well. So that was a new technique that was introduced, but a lot of new technologies were introduced at this time as well. For example, the steel plow or heavy plow, which used a blade that cut much deeper than the traditional wooden plows that had been used. The richer soil is deeper because it's not being exhausted through the crops drawing the nutrients out of the soil. And so if you've got a plow blade that can cut 10, 12 inches into the soil and turn that soil to the top, that's much better. Now, the downside of that plow is it creates a lot more friction, it's a lot more strain on your pack animals, and so a new full-body harness had to be invented rather than a traditional yoke, because in a traditional yoke that would put so much pressure just on the shoulders of the beast that it would hurt and the animal would eventually stop. So you created a full-body harness for them. So that's an example of new technologies. Also, Jethro Tull's seed drill. Instead of scattering seeds, you could actually have a drill that was drawn behind animals, and when you pushed a button or pulled a lever, it would poke a little hole down into the furrow and plant the seed down into the soil. So it was a much more efficient way of seeding your field. And so all of these things combined to produce an increase in agricultural production, an increase in yield. And what was great about that for the British was that really it led to an increase in population. The lack of food is always the number one brake or the number one check on population growth. Now England's population began to grow more rapidly because there was enough food. And that meant that there would be more laborers available for whatever they were going to be needed. And increasingly, that wasn't farming, because these new techniques and technologies led to increased agricultural yields with less need for agricultural labor. Fewer workers were producing more food, but yet you had more people being born. And so this opened the door then for people to work at something else rather than growing food. And that meant that these people became available as manufacturers in the earliest factories, for example. Now, factories were a new concept as well in Britain. Prior to the late 18th century, all manufacturing was being done by hand, by skilled workers. And generally it was being done in households. So we had what was known as the putting out system, which had prevailed largely since the early modern period, 1500s. Merchants were being frustrated by the fact that they could only purchase finished goods in towns where the guilds controlled the production of those goods, and since they controlled the production of those goods, they controlled the price. So merchants were looking for a way to get manufactured goods produced outside of the towns and outside of the guilds. So they entered into what became known as the putting out system, in which merchants would acquire raw materials and then load up their wagons and travel throughout the countryside. They would bypass the towns and travel throughout the countryside, sort of banging on cottage doors, farmers' cottages. Now, farmers, because they lived in isolation, had for generations been producing a lot of their own goods, clothes and shoes and things like that. And they passed those skill sets down from generation to generation. And so you could find this available labor. And the thing is that many farm families were more than excited to have this opportunity, because during the winter months, they really were inactive and they weren't producing income. But during the winter months, if they were provided with the raw materials, because they couldn't afford to acquire those raw materials themselves, but if they were provided with those raw materials, they could put their skills to work and produce these finished goods that they'd been producing for themselves, as I said, for generations. So it was a really good arrangement, because the merchants had the capital and the raw materials and didn't have the labor, the skills. The farmers had the skills but couldn't afford to acquire the raw materials on their own. So the system took advantage of this complementarity between the two groups. And what would happen then is in the spring, the merchants would come back and they would collect the finished products. So over the winter months, the family would work away at whatever it was that they were producing, and the merchants would come back in the spring, collect them, give some money to the family, and then take these finished goods and sell them at a profit. So the merchants were happy, the family was happy. I suppose the only people who weren't happy were the guilds, because they were being bypassed now. So this was the chief means of manufacturing in those days. It was still entirely done by workers who were employing skills that they developed. And the thing was that the chief inefficiency here was that to go from a pile of leather, say, to shoes required multiple skills, 16, 20, 35 different skills that had to be learned. And really, because it wasn't these people's full-time job, they might learn these skills as a younger person, but it would take a lifetime to master them. So one of the new concepts then was the idea of what we today call the factory system of production, or what is also referred to as the industrial division of labor, in which you take workers and you take the system of production, you take those 30 skills or whatever, and you break it down into its component parts. And rather than expecting one person to go from a pile of raw material to finished product, you would instead assign one person to perform only 2 or 3 of the tasks involved in transforming the raw materials to the finished goods. They would perform their 2 or 3 tasks, hand the workpiece on to the next person who would perform 2 or 3 tasks and hand it over, so that each person really only needed to learn and master 1, 2, 3, 4 skills. And that could be done much more efficiently, much more quickly. They could be trained in a very short amount of time, and because they were only doing that skill and doing it repeatedly, they would master it in a relatively short amount of time. And so this gave birth to what was known as the factory system of production, or the industrial division of labor. And it was noted by 1776 by Adam Smith in his work, The Wealth of Nations. It was noted in a section on a pin factory, where he had observed that there are 17 separate operations in going from metal to a paper package of pins. And he noted that this process had been broken down. And he argued that because of this way of organizing the work, that tens of thousands of pins could be produced in a day by a relatively small staff of workers, whereas if you had given them a block of metal and said, here, make pins, and each person had to work separately, they might have only produced a dozen pins in a day. So the pin factory was sort of Adam Smith's model for this new industrial division of labor, this new way of organizing labor. So that was a great reduction in efficiency. It was bringing together the labor under one roof. The factory gets its name from manufactory. bringing them together under one roof, and then dividing up their labor in this way. So it reduced a lot of the inefficiency. It reduced the inefficiency of the raw materials having to be taken and put out over a vast countryside, because you brought together the labor and the raw materials under one roof. It also reduced the inefficiency of learning and mastering skills, all those skills versus just the ones that you need to perform your little part of the task. The next way that the British began to reduce inefficiency was through the introduction of machines. Machines which would assist workers in performing their skill. So, for example, one of the early inventions which supported the textile industry, which grew into the first really big industry of the Industrial Revolution, one of the early inventions was James Hargreaves' flying shuttle loom. Prior to this, you weaved cloth by taking the vertical strands of thread, and you had them in a sort of a frame, a wooden frame, and you literally had to take then the horizontal strands and essentially on a needle and work your way back and forth through the vertical threads, and then when you got to the end, you would take a comb and comb it down. And then you'd have to work back the other direction and comb it down. And so the whole thing was done by hand. But James Hargreaves' flying shuttle loom, through the use of a sort of a pedal that was connected to a system of frames through which the threads were strung, and then with a sort of what was called a shuttle, a flying shuttle, which had string attached to it and could be thrown from one side to the other, and then you would push the pedal and it would bind the horizontal and vertical threads together. Really reduced the amount of time that it took to weave cloth. I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong name there. It was John Kay who invented the flying shuttle loom. James Hargreaves invented what was called the spinning jenny, which again used people power to sort of pushed a pedal, and through a system of gearing and belts, this would spin a wheel, and this wheel would then spin spindles, and you could feed raw cotton into these spindles, and on the other side pull thread. Prior to this time, thread had to be spun by hand. You had to literally twist thread by hand, and you break the thread and all sorts of problems. It was painstaking work. But by introducing these machines to the process, it increased the efficiency. You were still using workers who were familiar with the process of weaving or spinning, but you were giving them a machine to help them. So now, we're looking at all sorts of ways to reduce the inefficiency of manufacturing. You're putting the raw materials and the workers together, you're bringing them together in one place. You are dividing up the workers' tasks into their component parts, so they only have to learn and master one through repetition. Now you're giving them machines to help them out. At that point, then, really, one of the only remaining inefficiencies was power, because all these machines still relied on humans to power them, humans pushing a pedal or humans turning a crank or whatever it was. And human beings are notoriously inefficient providers of power. We get worn out, we get distracted, we get sick, we get bored, we get lazy, whatever. And so really one of the first alternatives for human power was the power of water, flowing water. Water flowing down out of the mountains comes at a pretty fast rate, and if you could harness that power and use it to power your machines, then you would have something more efficient than human power. And Richard Arkwright, who invented something called the water frame, developed a way to take the power of flowing water. Generally, that power would be generated by putting a wheel in the water and having the water either flow over or under the wheel, typically over the wheel. This would cause the wheel to turn, and then the wheel was connected to a sort of a drive shaft which entered into the factory. And from that drive shaft, you could connect belts to smaller drive shafts, and those drive shafts would then be turned by the belts would connect to the machines, leather belts typically, and these would provide power rather than having human beings provide power to a machine. And so all of these things were working together over the course of the 18th century to bring a new kind of efficiency to manufacturing in Great Britain. And so it was simply a matter of time before Britain developed a city whose economy was based on manufacturing rather than commerce, which most cities in Europe at that time the big cities were based on commerce. Their economies were based on commerce. Their growth was based on commerce. But the first city, it's thought, in the world whose economy was and growth was based on manufacturing was Manchester, located in Lancashire, which is sort of in the center of Great Britain along the Pennine Mountains. Lancashire was a region where the wool spinning and weaving trade had been historically very strong. It's a mountainous area. It was appropriate honestly, for herding sheep. And so you had skilled weavers and spinners there in the first place. But then additionally, the thing that was a backside to Manchester, or a downside to Manchester, was that it had no access to the ocean. So it didn't have access to, for example, the cotton, which was now going to be the chief raw material which drove the growth of Britain's textile industry. Really, cotton. Cotton from their American colonies, and then after American independence from the United States. Britain was still the United States' chief trading partner, even after independence. Cotton from India, cotton from Egypt, but it was all being imported, and so you needed access to a port. The port that provided access to the sea for Manchester was the port of Liverpool. It was right there on the coast. It's 20, 30 miles away. And then, of course, the other thing about a port is that you can then export your finished good, your cloth, in this case, to the world through that port. But again, Manchester was not on the sea. Liverpool was. But now we entered into the development of new transportation systems. Britain had had inherited pretty excellent opportunities for transportation or transportation assets because, one, it was an island. And it was an island penetrated by rivers, and so coastal trade was possible, and then upriver trade was possible. And then the Romans had brought their road network. But now, with the advent of big-time manufacturing, you needed to be able to move bulk cargo, and the rivers and the roads really didn't do that quite as effectively. As rivers flow one direction, roads don't provide any advantage. You've got to pack up a cart and really burden up your animals. So the British first complemented or supplemented what they had through the digging of canals. Canals are sort of like roads made of water, so you can take advantage of buoyancy. And it was noted that a team of horses tied up to a canal boat being pulled along a canal could transfer 20 times more cargo than a team of horses who were dragging carts along the roads. And so the canals, although expensive because of their lock systems, were an advantage over that. Now, it didn't take long, though, in the 19th century for the advent of railroads to displace canals, and this happened in the United States as well. George Stephenson is credited as the man who created the first commercially viable steam-powered locomotive. The steam engine was a new development. And in a way, it was a development that was more important for factories even than for locomotives. The water power that Richard Arkwright had pioneered was great, but it was sort of geographically limited. You had to locate yourself at the foothills of mountains where the streams were flowing very rapidly. But that's not necessarily where you wanted to put a factory, because the mountains is not where the ports were. The ports were down on the coast. It's not where the large groups of people were. So you had to locate your factory far away from access to raw materials, access to markets, access to labor. The steam engine was not invented with the idea of moving factories down into the big cities, but it did have that effect. The steam engine was initially invented by Thomas Newcomen, and he invented it to assist in the pumping of water out of coal mines. It was not extremely efficient. It had to be continually fed by water. And, Thomas Newcomen in general is not given credit for the invention of the steam engine. James Watt is. Well, James Watt did not invent it, but he did add a very, very important improvement to it. He added a condenser so that when the steam that was generating the force behind the steam engine that was pushing the piston in the steam engine, when that steam was released, it was released into a condenser, which condensed it back into water and then fed back into the system so that it could be boiled into steam again. So you weren't constantly having to recharge the steam engine with water. So that efficiency really made the steam engine an advantage that that could be put to work for a variety of things. It could be put to work, of course, pumping water out of coal mines, but it could now be put to work driving a locomotive forward and pulling a train. It could be put to work driving the wheels of a side wheel or stern wheel boat. And it could be put to work powering the machines in factories. And now you could locate your factories anywhere you wanted to, because you didn't have to rely on the flow of water. You could locate your factories way downstream where the flow slowed down. You could locate your factories in the big cities on the coast. And that's how the hallmark or the signature of the big manufacturing city of the 19th century became the smokestack, because they were burning coal to generate heat, to boil water, to produce steam, to power their machines. And so you had to have these big smokestacks to ventilate the smoke from the burning of the coal. But that really opened the door for, again, a reduction in inefficiency. The steam engine was very efficient as a source of power, and it also reduced the inefficiency of having to put your factories away from where all the things that the factories needed were located. And so this was the case with Manchester. It was made possible by James Watt's steam engine being employed in the emerging railroad system. George Stephenson invented the rocket, which was a steam-powered locomotive that could pull bulk cargo in a train behind it. And the first commercially successful railway was the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which connected the port of Liverpool with the emerging manufacturing center of Manchester. And with that, Manchester's population really took off, and it became the world's first manufacturing city. Now, in time certainly, that phenomenon spread throughout a lot of Great Britain, and then across to the continent of Europe, particularly in Western Europe, and across to the United States as well. There is a close connection between manufacturing and the growth of cities, or urbanization, because first of all, factories want to locate in cities, because generally speaking, cities were they were built around ports. So this gave access to raw materials coming in, it gave access to global markets going out. But big cities were also large population centers, and because of that, they were a source of labor. Your labor pool was there, and they were also a market, a home market that was right there. Large group of people who could buy the product who lived not far away at all. So factories tend to locate in cities, but then people moved into the cities to work in the factories. And once people moved in to work in the factories, then more people moved in to provide services to those people who were working in the factories. And so it has a sort of a snowball effect, or what economic geographers call a multiplier effect. So cities, once you get manufacturing going, once the Industrial Revolution gets moving in a society, the urbanization process picks up and tends to grow. So Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, Glasgow, London, they all began to grow very rapidly, and then moving across in the Netherlands and Belgium and France, and then eventually Germany and Italy, you began to see, and then of course in the United States as well, you began to see these industrial cities, these manufacturing cities growing. Really, I guess the last big step in the reduction of inefficiency was brought forward by an engineer named Mark Brunel. He saw that the factory system was an extremely efficient system, particularly once you introduced machines into the process, particularly once those machines were powered by steam engines. You could have a very efficient manufacturing system. The only thing was that you still had to rely on the people to use the machines properly. And that they didn't necessarily do it all the time. So what Mark Brunel picked up on was that you could use machines to make machines, and you could create machines that were Henry Maudsley, by the way, was a pioneer in what were called machine tools, machines whose purpose is to make the parts for other machines. And what Maudsley had discovered was that you could remake the same part over and over again, so that you could reproduce parts that were identical, and you could mass produce parts that were identical. Mark Brunel took this concept and said, okay, we're going to build machines that do exactly one thing. They can be set to do exactly one thing, not just boring or sawing or or planing or something like that, but boring exactly 1 inch or planing exactly a 1/16 of an inch off of something. You could set them to do exactly what you wanted to do so that you didn't have to rely on the user to know when to start pulling the lever and when to stop pulling the lever. It was simply, here's the workpiece, pull the lever as far as it'll go and release it, and then hand the workpiece to the next person. And the machine was now doing the smart part of the work. You had now completely taken all skill out of the process. Brunel's block-making system took all the skill out of the process. Brunel was under contract with the British Navy to produce what were called blocks, which were they were parts of a pulley that was in the rigging of a warship, and the Navy needed thousands of them. And so he set up shop in these 2 warehouses in Portsmouth, which was one of the big dockyards, it was one of the chief ports of the British Navy, the British fleet. And he set up a system that was powered by steam and entirely run. It was entirely a line of machines. And really the raw material here is wood. Wood goes in one end, blocks by the thousands come out on the other end. Because what was happening was the machine was essentially programmed to do what it needed to do. So the worker would take the workpiece, place it in the machine. Generally speaking, there would be a guide that would force you to place it in the correct way. Then you'd pull the lever, and the machine would do exactly what it was supposed to do, bore a 1 inch hole, whatever, release it, hand it to the next guy. So what we've seen is the complete deskilling of the manufacturing process. It's much more efficient, and now, because it requires essentially no skill at all, or it requires one very simple skill that can be learned in a day, really, in a matter of being trained in a matter of hours, and it's going to be mastered in a matter of days because you're going to do that one thing and do it over and over again. The last of the inefficiencies in that manufacturing system has sort of been squeezed out. And Brunel, like his counterpart, Eli Whitney, who was producing guns for the U.S. Army, sort of revolutionized and demonstrated the value of what was referred to in Britain as the factory system, or in the United States as the factory system. Ironically, in Britain, they referred to it as the American system. It was extremely efficient, but its efficiency created problems for workers. First of all, it created problems for skilled workers. All manufacturing prior to this time, as we said, had been done by skilled workers. And now they were being run out of a job. Look, the putting out system was bad enough for the guilds in the medieval towns, or the formerly medieval towns. It was bad enough for them. But now it wasn't just farmers who had spent a lifetime developing skills who were producing goods to compete with the guild's goods. Now it was people who had no skill at all. The work could be done by an immigrant who didn't speak the language. The work could be done by women. The work could be done by a 10-year-old child. And that's exactly what was happening. And so the first major eruption of protest against this came from a group of people called the Luddites. The Luddites were skilled workers who had seen their livelihood undermined by the advent of the factory system. And the Luddites claimed to be led by a sort of almost mythological figure named King Ned Ludd. It's not even clear whether King Ned Ludd was a real person. But all across England, in the early 18-teens, you had what were called Luddite riots, in which the Luddites would threaten factory owners to sort of shut down their operations, and when they didn't, they staged these nighttime raids in which they would enter into factories with axes and sledgehammers and whatever they get their hands on, and they would smash the machines. Now, initially, most of the violence of the Luddite riots was not directed against people; it was directed at the machines. But in time, the Luddites increasingly threatened individuals. There were kidnappings. There were assaults. There was arson, and gradually the government of England began to crack down on the Luddites, and eventually by say 1816, 1817, the Luddite riots had sort of settled down. They had dissipated. Many of their leaders had been arrested or killed. The economy was beginning to turn around so that there was less angst in the economy. And I think maybe gradually it was simply being seen that the system was not going to change. So that was the first group of people who were sort of outraged by the advent of the industrial system of manufacturing. But very soon there began to be seen problems for those who were very much a part of that system, not being put out of work by the system, but who were being given work by that system, and that was the growing manufacturing class, the working class, the people who were working in the factories. David Ricardo, who was a British economist, philosopher, with what was known as the Manchester School. Now, this is a group of economic thinkers. There's no physical building that was the Manchester School. It was a group of thinkers who sort of shared common philosophies, and they were some of the first economists, people who looked at economics as a discipline in and of itself. He noted that labor, because labor is a commodity, like all other commodities, like all other goods or services, he noted that the price of labor, or the wage, is determined by supply and demand. If you have a large supply of labor that is growing faster than the demand for it is growing, then the price of it, the wage, will go down. If you have a short supply of labor and the demand for it is growing faster, then the price of labor, the wage, will go up. But the problem with the new industrial system of manufacturing was that it required no skill. And therefore anybody, as we said before, anybody could do the work. So actually the demand for factory labor was going up because there were more factories open. But the thing is that since anybody could do the work, the supply of that sort of labor was almost limitless. And so far from improving the value of, or far from improving the wages of factory workers, what they were seeing was their wages in decline and even being pushed down to what's referred to as a survival wage, and in some cases below a survival wage, so that no family, no working class family could survive on the wage of the father alone. The mother would have to enter into the factory, and the children would have to enter into the factory, and they were welcomed there because factory owners found it easy to justify paying women and children less. Women could be paid less because they were seen to be, women and children both, could be paid less because they were seen to be less productive. They were seen to be physically weaker. They didn't have the stamina. Children in particular were easily distracted, and so they were less productive. So factory owners found it easy to justify paying them less. And then additionally, since women and children were not seen to be the chief breadwinners for the family, their income was seen to be supplemental. So owners found not only an economic but a moral argument for paying them less. Well, the family doesn't need them to be paid as much because their income is only supplemental, not fundamental, not essential. So, many working families saw their wages pressed down below the survival level because they could be so easily replaced. Because anybody could do the work, because the supply of that kind of labor was essentially limitless. And so David Ricardo noted that in times like these, the lives of a working class would become pretty miserable because at some point your wage, that is the price that you can get for your labor, declines below the level at which it costs you to generate labor, that is to feed yourself, to clothe yourself, to keep yourself in shelter. And that is when it goes below survival level. And he didn't really make a judgment on it. He simply noted that it was a pretty miserable time to be an unskilled factory worker. Some factory workers tried to resolve the problem by forming into trade unions. And the idea of a union was that if you couldn't individually negotiate for a higher wage because you could be so easily replaced, maybe if an entire group of workers refused to work at a certain wage, then they could negotiate. It was sort of strength through numbers. That was the philosophy of the unions. That, let's say, all the workers in a factory would gather together and agree that if they weren't paid more, if their demands for better pay or safer conditions or whatever else were not met, they would simply go on strike. They would refuse to work for that owner anymore. And that although it would be easy for an owner to replace one worker who did that, it wouldn't be easy for an owner to replace all of them. The problem was that it actually was. I mean, 1,000 unskilled workers? Yes, most cities had 1,000 unskilled workers, had more than 1,000 unskilled workers who'd happily take your job. And so it made it very hard for unions to make strikes work. And sort of inevitably strikes became violent because the only way that a union that was on strike could make its strike work is to make sure that the owner could not bring in replacement workers. And the only way you could do that was by sort of physically blocking the factory gates and not letting them come in. So inevitably these turned to violence, and the government had to suppress it. Finally, in 1799, the British government passed a law called the Combination Act, and the Combination Act outlawed unions, and of course outlawed striking. The Combination Act was repealed in 1824, and almost immediately there was an eruption of strikes all across Great Britain, and so the Combination Act was then restored, and unions were again prohibited in the 19th century. One of the things that I noted about this is that I think it helps to explain why, in the United States, labor unions continue to believe that their best bet for getting the interests of their workers taken care of is through direct negotiation with the employer. Whereas in Britain, labor unions, because they were banned for so long, seem to believe that their best bet is through working through the government to achieve reforms. And so labor was very much involved in politics. As a matter of fact, by the end of the 19th century, you're going to have the establishment of a political party called the Labor Party to pursue the interests of that working class. We don't have that exactly in the United States, and I think that this is sort of the reason that the United States never banned labor unions. Labor unions in the United States found that they could get what they wanted through direct negotiation with their employers. So the working class was confronted by low wages, and during the era of the Napoleonic Wars, so the first half of the 18 teens, they were also confronted by shortages, which made things very expensive. So bread in particular was very expensive. This actually suited the big farmers in England, people who owned large tracts of land. And there had been more and more of those since the first part of the 18th century. During the 1700s, you had a movement in England called the Enclosure Movement, in which Parliament and then local governments passed laws called Enclosure Acts, in which land which had been common land, available to anybody to farm and to graze, land which had been held in common was now eligible to be purchased and enclosed by private landowners, and wealthy people had snapped up the common lands. This really drove a lot of the peasants out of agriculture. Many of them land in manufacturing because they're driven out of agriculture. Formerly they could work on the common lands, now they couldn't. So by 1815, most of the farming that was being done in Great Britain was being done in large operations, by large landowners. They had really enjoyed the Napoleonic Wars because during that time it was hard to get grain imported into Great Britain. The French were intruding upon it and that sort of thing. And so what that meant was that if you were a producer of grain, if you were a big landowner, big farmer in England, and you were producing grain, you were getting a high price for it because grain was rare. It was hard to come by. And that's why bread cost so much. And that was horrible for the working class. It was great if you're a big farmer. When the Napoleonic Wars ended, there was a lot of worry by these big landowners, these big farm owners, that the introduction of international trade in grain, which is called corn in the UK, the word corn in the UK and in general in Europe refers to grain in general. Not what we call corn, they call maize. So there was concern that the restoration of the international trade in corn, which we call grain, would create competition and drive the prices down. Now, the working class was happy about that. Bread was going to be less expensive. But some very influential landowners, many of whom were members of Parliament, were worried that they would lose some of that profit that they'd been making. And so they passed a series of laws, which were known as the Corn Laws. And these laws prohibited the import of grain. So it was essentially a way of keeping the price of grain in Great Britain artificially high at a time when the working class was desperately waiting for that price to come down so they could afford bread to feed their families. So the Corn Laws were an outrage to the working class, and in 1819 we see a gathering. We see many working class gatherings to protest the Corn Laws. One of these led to an event called the Peterloo Massacre. St. Peter's Fields was a polo fields on the outskirts of Manchester, of course, a big group of working class people, the first in the world, and they were protesting the Corn Laws when local authorities cleared the fields by force, and dozens were injured. It really wasn't a massacre. The term Peterloo comes from St. Peter's Fields and the Battle of Waterloo, which had thousands of casualties. So it was kind of a hyped sort of thing, a lot like the Boston Massacre. But it was an alarming event to the British government. They feared that it would lead to working class uprisings and that sort of thing. And so the British government responded by passing a series of laws called the Six Acts. And the Six Acts were laws that did things like prohibit large public gatherings without prior consent. It made it harder for newspapers to be transmitted through the mails. It increased the fees for that because newspapers were seen as sources of radicalism. It suppressed free speech. This was all in line with what Clemens von Metternich was doing over on the continent of Europe. This is an era immediately following the defeat of Napoleon in which, in general, governments were fearful of their peasant classes. It had been seen what they could do in France. You know, they had cut off their king's head, and they had completely overthrown the government. And so many governments all across Europe were increasingly fearful of the power of the peasants, the power of the working class, the power of the masses, and were taking steps to suppress them. And almost all of these involved censorship and secret police, penetrating radical societies, and that kind of thing. Well, that took the form of the Six Acts in Britain. But the Six Acts were also a direct response to the Peterloo Massacre. The reality is that it didn't work. The Corn Laws were seen as an outrage not only by the working class, but increasingly by middle class politicians. The general mood, or the general political philosophy in Britain and throughout a lot of Western Europe during this era was that of classical liberalism, which you have to be a little bit careful about because today, in the United States in particular, in the second half of the 20th century, liberalism is associated with very active government, high taxes, that sort of thing, a government which seeks to play a role in shaping the economy. But classical liberalism really takes two forms. One branch of classical liberalism is political liberalism, and political liberalism refers to a belief in constitutional government, a belief that government ought to have limits on its powers, a belief in civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of worship, that kind of thing. And then additionally, political liberalism embraces expansion of suffrage. Later on in the 19th century, it embraced expansion of suffrage. On the other hand, economic liberalism was very much the opposite of what we today think of as liberalism. Economic liberalism referred to government keeping its hands off the economy, what we might call laissez-faire, free trade, property rights, things like that. It put more of the power over the economy in the hands of individuals and rejected the idea that the government should be interfering in the economy. And so, for example, mercantilism, in which the government exercised a very controlling hand over the economy, would have been rejected by classical liberals. Classical liberalism, particularly on the economic side, is the philosophy of the Manchester School, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, guys like that. And classical liberalism in general was embraced by the political leaders of Great Britain, most of whom were middle-class people, most of whom were merchants, bankers, early manufacturers, people who believed that they were generally better off and that the economy was better off if the government did not interfere in it. So it wasn't just the working class who disliked the Corn Laws. Obviously, for them, it meant higher grain prices, higher bread prices, harder to feed their families at a time when they really weren't making a lot of money. But classical liberals, most political leaders in Britain, didn't like these laws either because they represented a very significant interference by the government on the economy. It was a violation of the concept of free trade. You're not going to allow grain to be traded freely. And so the Anti-Corn Law League became the next really big social movement in Britain following the collapse of the Luddite movement. The Anti-Corn Law League held huge meetings, enormous public meetings, oftentimes in violation of the Six Acts, and there was nothing the British government could do about it. And eventually the Anti-Corn Law League did manage to get the corn laws repealed. But by this time, the Parliament was really divided into two political parties, the Tories and the Whigs. Now, the Tories and the Whigs had been the two dominant, really just the two political parties in Britain going all the way back into the 18th century. The Tories had originated as a party dedicated to the restoration of absolute monarchy, dedicated to the restoration of the Stuarts in particular to power. The Whigs, on the other hand, believed that Parliament must function as an effective check on the power of the monarch. And so they enjoyed having foreigners like the Georges, the House of Hanover, ruling as king, because they ruled by the invitation of Parliament, by the consent of Parliament. They could be controlled by Parliament. So those were the Tories and the Whigs. But by the middle of the 18th century, by 1746, the last of the Jacobite uprisings, the last effort to get the Stuarts restored to power had failed. And so the Tories were really discredited. They had backed the wrong horse. They seemed like traitors, and they seemed like losers because they were against the government of the Georges, and they had failed. So during the middle of the 18th century, then, the Whigs had become a dominant party. The thing is, they had become so dominant, and they had formed such a cozy relationship with the Georges, with the House of Hanover, with the king, that they had ceased to be an effective check on the king's power. They did what the king wanted them to do. They did what they were told. And many Whigs noted that their party had strayed, therefore, from very far away from its founding principles. Parliament was no longer an effective check on the power of the monarch. And so some of the Whigs had sort of split off from the rest of the Whigs and said, well, we want to go back to what our party was originally all about, being an effective check on the power of the king. Other Whigs said, this is great, we like this. This is a good deal for us. We're getting patronage from the kings. We're getting position for our children and for our sons, position in government. This is a good deal, business as usual. So what happened was those who wanted to go back to being a true check on the power of the king, they continued to be known as Whigs. And those who were sort of happy with business as usual and wanted to continue their relationship with the Georges and their cozy relationship, they became known as Tories. So the Tories make a comeback, and they then became the dominant party because of their relationship with the Georges. They had a real advantage in governing Britain. And so really from, say, the 1760s up through 1830s, the Tories then were the dominant power in government. The Whigs sort of had been from, say, the 1720s up through the 1760s or 70s, and then in the 1770s through the 1830s, the Tories were. They used their relationship with the kings to maintain their power. There was a brief moment immediately after the British defeat at the Battle of Yorktown when Tory policy toward the American colonists, was so discredited that they briefly lost their majority in the House of Commons, but it was very shortly thereafter restored, so it's hardly even worth noting. But anyway, by the 19th century, by the 1830s, let's say, the Tories were increasingly known as the Conservative Party, and they were led by William Pitt the Younger. This is the son of William Pitt the Elder. You learned about William Pitt the Elder in the previous review session when we talked about his role in turning the tide of the 7 Years' War in favor of the British. His son, William Pitt the Younger, was the leader of the Conservatives, or Tories, in the early 19th century. The Whigs Whigs, who, by the way, were increasingly known as liberals, were led by Charles James Fox. He was a hardcore reformer, and most of the Whigs were. although one is called the Conservatives and one is called the Liberals, they both embraced economic liberalism. Less so political liberalism, but both parties embraced economic liberalism, laissez-faire, free trade, that kind of thing. Conservatives were not utterly opposed to change, but they did believe that change ought to be managed so that the most important social institutions and social and political traditions were maintained. They were less open to the ideas of political liberalism. The thing is, Britain already had constitutional government. Britain already had limits on the powers of the monarch. Britain already had freedom of worship and some of those other things. But the reformers, the Whigs, the liberals, they were the ones who then were pushing for things like the restoration of free speech and freedom of assembly and also expanded suffrage. For example, one of the major problems in British politics by this time was that members of the House of Commons were elected out of boroughs whose boundaries had been established back during the medieval era. And particularly since the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the growth of big cities like Manchester and London too, a lot of those boundaries were really out of date because, for example, the borough which surrounded Manchester now had 300,000 people living in it. It was represented by 2 members of the House of Commons. On the other hand, there was a borough known as Old Sarum, which was essentially one noble family, a family who had feudal contracts going back probably to William the Conqueror. It was their feudal estate, and there were now only 7 people living there, but still it elected 2 people to the House of Commons. So these boroughs, which had sort of represented the worst of the worst, the boroughs where you had a very small number of people living, but they still were electing members of the House of Commons and therefore were grotesquely overrepresented, became known as rotten boroughs. And so you have a member of the Whig Party whose name was John Russell. John Russell was a member of the House of Commons, an MP, member of Parliament. He was a Whig or a Liberal, and he was looking to reform the system. He offered up what was known as the Reform Bill, and what he proposed to do was redraw the boundaries so that working-class people concentrated in big cities like Manchester, which had only gotten big in the last 50 years, would now have an opportunity to be represented more fairly in the House of Commons than they had been. Because they hadn't been. Clearly, those who had these big estates were represented, had greater representation in the House of Commons than those who lived in the big cities. So what they wanted to do, John Russell wanted to redraw the boundaries to reflect the changing population of Britain. The Reform Bill would also expand suffrage to all males who were producing or who were paying at least £10 sterling, the British unit of currency, at least £10 sterling in taxes per year, which would mean that the previous qualification for voting, which was you had to be a male who was owning a certain amount of property, that was going to go away, and now you're expanding the suffrage even to non-property people, like working-class people. This, of course, would be great for the Whigs, because they had established themselves as sort of the party of reform, the party, therefore, that would be looking out for the interests of working class, whereas the Conservatives were well established as the party of the privileged elites. If you kept the vote in the hands of the privileged elites by maintaining this property qualification, that would continue to support the Conservatives' majority in the House of Commons. On the other hand, if you throw the vote open to working class people, people who pay taxes but don't own land, and if you redraw these boundaries, certainly the Whigs are going to gain an advantage, maybe even gain the majority in the House of Commons. So it was to the political advantage of the Whigs or liberals to propose this change. And I think philosophically it was in line with what they believed as well. But, of course, the Reform Bill was rejected at that time, in 1831. But, because at that time the Tories or Conservatives still had a majority in the House of Commons, so it was rejected in the House of Commons. But the Whigs, the Liberals, were then able to use this as a campaign issue in 1832. And they were managed to gain the sympathies of a lot of middle-class people all across England. People who owned property, therefore, could vote. They had been voting Tory. Now they quickly switched over and voted for the Whigs, largely based on their philosophical leanings. And so in 1832, the Whigs then gained their first majority in Parliament, in the House of Commons, since immediately after the Battle of Yorktown, and they used it to pass the Reform Bill of 1832. It was, however, certain to be rejected by the House of Lords, because the House of Lords was made up entirely of these nobles, and they didn't want to give up on their political advantage. But at this point, the king intervened, and this was King William IV. He was the end of a string of Georges. You had George I, George II, George III, George IV. William IV was the son of George III, who was the king during the American Revolution. He was the younger brother of George IV, and William IV was a Whig. He was a liberal. He was a reformer. He believed in this stuff. And so when it became apparent that the Reform Bill, having passed the House of Commons, would be rejected by the House of Lords, William IV threatened that if the House of Lords rejected the Reform Bill, he was going to start naming new lords. Because he could, as king. He could start appointing lords, because that's how you get into the House of Lords. You're appointed by the king. And he could essentially pack the House of Lords with reformers. Well, that was a fate even worse than having the Reform Bill pass, and so the House of Lords consented, and the Reform Bill of 1832 became law. The boundaries were redrawn, the suffrage was expanded. A pretty impressive feat for the reformers. Now, I will tell you that not everybody was impressed by the accomplishments of the reformers, the liberals. There was a group called the Chartists, who developed what they called the People's Charter, which was a list of demands or petitions which they presented to Parliament that would have taken these reforms farther. So, for example, part of the People's Charter was universal male suffrage, not the still. The Reform Act had expanded the suffrage, but it still had limits on it. So part of the People's Charter was universal male suffrage. The People's Charter called for members of Parliament to be compensated, because at that time they weren't. And therefore a person who was not sort of independently wealthy really wasn't eligible to serve in Parliament. So these are examples of some of the demands of the Chartist movement. And interestingly, when you look down in the long run, the Chartist movement, most of the demands of the People's Charter were eventually achieved, but long after the movement itself had died out. The problem was that the movement attracted great attention, and again you had these sort of mass public meetings that were reminiscent of the Anti-Corn Law League meetings, but as they met up with resistance, a lot of the leaders of the Chartist movement got more radical in their rhetoric, got even violent in their rhetoric. It suggested that class warfare might, even a revolution might be in the making, and that turned lots of people off. It turned even working class people off. And one of the problems with Marxism and some of the associated movements that were meant to be in the name of the working class people was that they reached too far and demanded too much and threatened too much, and as a result turned people off. And that was the case with the Chartist movement. But as I say, in the end, a lot of their demands were met around, by the early 20th century. Another great movement among the reformers was that of the utilitarians. And the chief spokesperson for the utilitarian philosophy was Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham essentially defined utilitarianism this way. He said, when you're confronted with a decision on a course of action, the morally superior decision is the one which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And this is interesting because Bentham was kind of in line with the classical liberals in that, generally speaking, he did not believe that government could effectively produce happiness, but that individuals largely had to produce it for themselves. And so he was very suspicious of any effort by the government to reform society or change society in an effort to produce a broad happiness. To the extent that it did, he wanted the government to be closely accountable to the people, so he was a big supporter of proposals like the Reform Bill. Anything that would give the people greater representation in government, anything that would make the government more accountable to the people, he was in favor of that. But in general, he believed government should largely keep its hands off. He believed that, generally speaking, government, when it tried to make some people happy, usually did so at the expense of others. And although he had only one counterexample, and that was education. He pointed that in education, you could give education to some without taking it from others. That is, knowledge could be shared without it being lost by the person who gives it. So it's an interesting perspective. But broadly speaking, he said government shouldn't get involved in trying to promote happiness. To the extent that they did, he favored actions which would protect society and give people a safe environment in which to pursue their own happiness. And famously, one of the reforms proposed and promoted by the Benthamites, not Bentham himself, because he had died, actually, by the time this was all happening. He died in 1832 or 33. But the Benthamites promoted, for example, a different approach to handling the poor. The poor often were neglected, and so a poor law was passed under the influence of the Benthamites, and it created sort of workshops because it was believed that the poor were poor as a result of bad work ethic and laziness, and so these workshops or workhouses were places where the poor could be sent to learn work ethic. And how did they learn it? They learned it through hard work, manual labor. And they learned it without distraction. Males were separated from females. They were provided with sort of minimal food and shelter. And the idea was that you didn't want them to sort of get to like it and become dependent. They were supposed to learn a hard work ethic and not become dependent on the workhouse environment itself. It became one of the more hated reforms. It was a target for Charles Dickens in his writings because in the end it seemed almost crueler than the neglect that many of the poor had suffered. But at the time, from the classical liberal perspective, this was or from the utilitarian perspective too, this was the kind of reform that made sense. Now, some of the other reforms at that time, were a little bit more well-received and targeted some of the specific problems of the working class. So, for example, the issue of child labor was tackled by a commission established by the House of Commons, led by Member of Parliament Michael Sadler, who is therefore known as the Sadler Commission. Sadler Commission investigated the conditions of children in factories and, of course, found that children in particular were subject to all sorts of horrible conditions, factory hours that they were expected to work that were equal to those of adult males, which were 14 and 16 hours a day and long beyond their capacity, beatings at the hands of overseers who were hired to keep them on task, and especially chronic injuries which they suffered because of the level at which their bones and muscular systems were developed. All workers in the factories tended to suffer chronic injuries because they found themselves in an erect position or in a stooped over position, or whatever position the machine demanded them to be in to operate the machine for hours and hours at a time. And so it was very typical for chronic injuries and deformities to come about among workers, but among children in particular, because their musculoskeletal systems were only developing at that time. And so the Sadler Commission basically proposed that some sort of protection for children needed to be enacted, and this came in the form of the Factory Act and the Mines Act. And as a matter of fact, the Factory Act and the Mines Act actually extended protections to both children and women. But the Factory Act, for example, set limits on the number of hours that children could be hired in factories. Now, it's astonishing to discover that prohibiting child labor meant that no child under the age of 9 was permitted to work in a factory. But then from age 9 on up through adulthood, there was a sort of a stepped, right, from age 9 to age 12, you were allowed to work 8 hours a day. And from age 12 to age 14, you were allowed to work 10 hours a day. And from age 14 to age 18, you were allowed to work 12 hours a day. And then once you reached age 18, you were considered to be an adult, and you could decide for yourself how many hours you could work or how many hours you were willing to work. And so there was no protection after that. It's interesting, though, that women and children were considered to be a special class of people and needed protection by the state. But the classical liberal perspective was that adult males were not. And so there were no such protections extended to adult males. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I would also mention something called the 10 Hours Act, which was an evolution. The Factory Act and its limitations on the numbers of hours children and women could work went through evolutions and eventually settled upon what was known as the 10 Hours Act, which limited children and women to 10 hours of work per day, unless they were in that class that was only allowed to work 8. The Mines Act completely prohibited women and children being hired to work underground. Mines were a particularly dangerous place to work due to everything from cave-ins to suffocation, fires, explosions, flooding. Mines were a very dangerous place, and so women and children were removed. But you notice that there are no protections in any of this for adult males. No OSHA, no workplace conditions standards established by the British government. And again, I think that points out that this is a classical liberal mentality. The government ought not to be interfering with the decision of an adult male to work or not work, as he chose, for an employer. If an employer was not providing a safe work environment, then an adult male was free to choose not to work for him. Women and children were considered to be special cases, and so government could get involved, but adult males couldn't. But the reality is that factories were dangerous places, not just for children and women, but for adult males as well. In addition to the chronic injuries and deformities that they would suffer and the danger of mines, there were long-term dangers. In mines, coal dust would be breathed in, causing black lung, damaging the linings of the lung. In textile mills, you had white lung, in which cotton fibers kicked up into the air through the operation of machines would damage the inner linings of the lung. So adult males faced these same dangers just as women did, but from the classical liberal perspective, they could choose to subject themselves to that or not. There were, of course, a lot of problems also that came up because of rapid urbanization. The cities that were now growing so fast were actually growing much faster than the city authorities could meet the demand for space. So, in particular, housing was a problem. There were housing shortages everywhere because you couldn't build housing fast enough to accommodate all the people who were moving into the cities so rapidly. Part of the reason for this was that you couldn't really build up, because at this time most structures were wood framed, and wood has a very sort of limited capacity, structural capacity as you go upward, maybe 6 or 7 stories at the most, and you couldn't really build outward either. Because people were walking to work at that time, and with a 14 or even a 16-hour workday, you couldn't afford to live more than about 3 miles from your place of work, because that's an hour's walk. So if you're looking at a 16-hour workday or a 14-hour workday, let's say 14 hours, you walk there, you walk back, 16 hours, that leaves you with 8 hours to eat and sleep, and that's just about the minimum. So you couldn't build out, you couldn't build up. Now, in time, the advent of iron and then steel-framed structures helped build taller buildings, and that could accommodate residences. But in terms of building outward, the necessity of some sort of public transportation came along, and so you began to see more and more cities investing in public transportation systems, whether they might be streetcars, horse-powered, steam-powered, electrical-powered eventually, or in the really densely populated areas, subways, subway trains, underground trains like the London Underground or the Tube, which was actually known as the Metropolitan Railway, which helped to extend the residential radius of the city outward so that you could help to alleviate some of the crowding and some of the problems that went along with it. And lots of problems went along with crowding. First of all, when the demand for housing so far exceeds the supply, the price of it makes it out of the range of the average working family. And so a lot of apartments which were designed to house one family ended up housing two or three. And that contributed to the rapid spread of disease. And also just the overloading of infrastructure. You had diseases like cholera, which were very common, typically passed through tainted water supply. Most of the water supply in the cities was gained through wells, but the city's infrastructure did not yet include an effective sewage system. So people dumped their waste in the streets, or they buried it in cesspits in their backyards or in their cellars, or they simply dumped it into cesspools. And inevitably, what was happening was the waste product and the bacteria that was growing in it made its way into the water supply and into the wells. And as a result, thousands of people would be infected with cholera and die. Typhus was another one that came about typically because of lice, which lived in unsanitary environments and could spread quickly in crowded areas. It's one of those diseases because it was carried by lice. The lice could move from person to person, hatching their eggs in people's scalps, and then when people would scratch their scalps, they would break open the eggs, and they would also break open the skin on their scalps, and the infection would get into their bloodstream. So in those crowded conditions, and in those conditions where infrastructure really wasn't anywhere near modern, or even approaching the level, say, of the ancient Romans 2,000 years before, disease spread very rapidly. And so it took the work of people like Edwin Chadwick. Edwin Chadwick was a physician who was appointed by Parliament, again, to conduct an investigation into the causes of disease. And he was one of the first in his report to identify tainted water supply as the major cause of the spread of disease in big cities. And so as a result of Chadwick's report, a law called the Public Health Act was promulgated by the House of Commons, and this placed responsibility for public health on the government's shoulders. And later editions of the Public Health Act began to specify things like drainage and sewerage and building requirements, building standards. And as a result, public health improved. As a matter of fact, by 1900, late 19th century, you still were having cholera outbreaks all across Europe, but fewer and fewer of them were happening in England because they were enacting these reforms. I will point out that overall there was not a very good understanding of disease. The chief theory which people believe caused disease was called the miasmatic theory, that disease was caused by miasma, M-I-A-S-M-A, which held that disease was contained in tainted air, foul-smelling air. It's not that far off because they believed that the particles of decomposing bodies were what caused air to smell foul. And they believed that disease was spread through the air, and people would, when they had foul-smelling air, people would drape their windows in lime-soaked cloths and things and send their children out to the country to get away from it. There was a particular summer known as the Summer of the Big Stink, a summer in which there was drought and the Thames River in London was quite low, and people who were dumping their waste into the open sewers, the waste was being washed down to the river, but it wasn't going anywhere, and the whole city smelled foul. They had to shut down Parliament, and finally this is what led to a proposal to build an underground sewer system for London, the overseer of which Joseph Bazalgette is today memorialized with his own statue, larger than life-size statue in London, commemorating his role in making the city livable. So the miasmatic theory of disease at least brought about, although it was inaccurate, at least brought about an important change in the civil infrastructure of the city of London. In terms of really pinning down the cause of disease, you had public health efforts by doctors like John Snow. John Snow managed to actually pin down through a study of the locations of persons affected by cholera. He managed to pin down the location of the cholera outbreak, the source of the cholera outbreak, to the Broad Street well and pump. But even with these advances, people still really didn't attach themselves to a new theory of disease. And it's not until the 20th century that the germ theory really settles in, and it's not until the 20th century that doctors really know how to treat disease, because it's not until then that they really understand what caused disease. So public health was... the concept of public health, and the government had some responsibility for it, was emerging in the 19th century, first of all in Britain and then moving to other countries. But it was still had a ways to go in terms of really understanding what the cause of disease was. As for some of the other big city problems, such as crime, in the end, again, it took acts of government brought about by reformers. And would these acts have been taken in a parliament that was not sort of taken over by the Whigs after 1832, which it was? The Whigs, the Liberals, sort of capitalized on the new voting system created by the Reform Act, and sort of took over majority in the House of Commons throughout most of the 19th century. Would these kinds of reforms have been made possible without them? It's hard to say. Perhaps some of the conservatives would have come around to these, but I think that having a liberal government in place, as opposed to not in France and in some other places, as you'll see, is what allowed Britain to get ahead of the rest of Europe in fighting some of these problems. But, for example, London had the first government-supported police brigade or police force in Europe. The Bobbies, they were established by an act of parliament promoted by Robert Peel, which is why they got the name Bobbies. But, before that time, you didn't have a professional police force in London. The peace was kept by a group of constables who were ill-trained and essentially ill-prepared for the work. Similarly, there was no fire protection to speak of. In a city like London, fire protection was a subscription service that you paid for. And, you could pay for it or not pay for it. But if you didn't pay for it, or say if your neighbor chose not to pay for it, and his house caught on fire, it could have an enormous effect on you, because his house could be burning, and because he didn't pay the subscription service to the private fire protection company there, his house would burn. And by the time you got around to calling your subscription service, your house was now on fire. But London eventually established the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, so the Metropolitan Police Force, Metropolitan Fire Brigade, Metropolitan Railway. These were all government solutions to big city problems. So, as I said, Britain sort of leads the way in making these reforms happen. And so, as you roll through the 19th century, through the mid-19th century, as I said, the Liberals had an advantage in Parliament over the Conservatives, because they were seen as the party that was making these changes happen. When the leadership of the two parties was sort of handed over, when the torch was handed from William Pitt of the Conservatives and then Charles Fox of the Liberals to the next sort of generation of great leaders, things began to change a little bit. The leader of the Liberals was William Gladstone, Glastone, in the mid-19th century, and the leader of the Conservatives was Benjamin Disraeli, Disraeli. Disraeli was an interesting sort of... These guys, first of all, didn't like each other, despised each other. Disraeli was an interesting sort of conservative. By this time, I think he had come to the conclusion that the social institutions and conventions that past generations of conservatives were trying to preserve had sort of passed. There was no saving them. And now he simply wanted to be competitive in elections, which the conservatives really had not been since 1832. So in 1867, he proposed something called the Reform Bill of 1867, which, again, would redraw the boundaries and would expand the suffrage almost to the point of universal male suffrage, not quite. He was hoping that he could out-liberal the Liberals, or outwig the Whigs, or whatever you want to call it. He was hoping that he could persuade voters that the Conservatives actually could be an effective party to protect and promote the interests of the working class. It didn't work out for him. The bill was passed, and the Liberals were elected to an even larger majority in the House of Commons than before. But it represented another step toward reform and toward greater representation of the working class in Parliament. In time, though, Disraeli did succeed in making British politics more competitive. And part of that was because the Liberals under Gladstone tended to lose their focus, and whereas the Whig Liberals of the earlier mid-19th century were focused on reforms that would affect the working class people who were their new constituency, the Liberals of Gladstone in a lot of ways didn't. They focused on reforms like eliminating religious tests for admission into the universities, reforming the civil service to be more meritocratic rather than spoils-based, kind of like Chester Alan Arthur did at this time here in the United States. They focused on those kinds of reforms, and Gladstone also got himself focused on kind of our next topic, which is the empire. Britain was now confronted with the impulse to build a great empire, which really in many ways they already had a pretty impressive empire, but Gladstone was sort of confronted by the impulse to expand it, and Disraeli and the Conservatives jumped all over that, and they were very favorable. It was a sort of a patriotic thing, and so they were favorable to the expansion of empire. William Gladstone was not. He and the Liberals took the position that empire building was almost wasteful and almost wicked. It was actually Gladstone who proposed some sort of relief for the Irish, and we're going to be talking about the Irish next. But it turns out that Gladstone was on the wrong side of public opinion here. Disraeli and the Conservatives managed to sell the British public on the patriotism of building empire and the importance of demonstrating the greatness of Great Britain. And they were also able to sell the public on the idea that the Irish were wicked and they ought not to be set free. And so eventually Disraeli bested Gladstone and managed to defeat Gladstone, and the Conservatives gained their first majority in the House of Commons in a long time. But from that point on, it just showed you how competitive British politics could be when the two parties decided to compete for the loyalty of the voters. Prior to this time, that's not how British politics was played. The two sides sort of carved out who their clientele were. The Conservatives represented the privileged elites. The Liberals represented the sort of growing middle class and working class. And they simply tried to fight over the rules of the game. So who would get to vote, who wouldn't get to vote, how would they be represented? That was what British politics was about. But Disraeli changed all that. He instead of bickering over the rules of the game, he made a big shift and took the Conservative Party in a direction where they were going to compete for the same voters that Gladstone and the Liberals were. And from that point on, British politics became more and more competitive. Now, the Liberals didn't know it, but they were almost on their way out. The defeat to the Conservatives, the unpopularity of Gladstone's anti-imperialist policy and his policy on Ireland led to his defeat, but it also made the Liberals a party that was vulnerable. There really never was a strong socialist movement in Britain. I think that a lot of Marxists, when they're confronted with the fact that Marx's worldwide proletarian revolution never happened, a lot of Marxists will say, well, governments sort of figured it out, and in an act of self-preservation, they created reforms, and they legalized trade unions, and unions were made legal again in Britain. They legalized unions, they listened to the demands of the working class, they created reforms, and in this way, these governments put off the Marxist they put off the proletarian revolution, the working class revolution, but it is still inevitable, was the view of Marxists. Well, Great Britain would be a great example of that. It's certainly true that Britain didn't develop a strong socialist movement, perhaps because they did a good job of dealing with the problems of the working class, really before any other country in Europe did. And so you do have the socialist movement in Britain were known as the Fabians, Fabian, the Fabian Society, and they were what Marx would have called utopian socialists, or if you prefer, revisionist socialists. These were people who believed that socialist outcomes, a more equal distribution of income, a basic standard of living for everybody, could be accomplished without a full-blown socialist revolution of the sort Marx described. Now, Marx thought that was foolishness. That's why he calls them utopian socialists. They're believing something that's not real in a way. But that was about as radical as the British got. Now, in 1900, those Fabians got together with the leaders of unions. And remember, I mentioned that I think partially because unions had been illegal for so long, most of the unionists came to believe that their best bet to get what they needed was not negotiation with the employers, but rather entering into politics and changing things that way. And so out of this merger between those two groups was born the Labour Party. And the Labour Party actually came to displace the Liberal Party as the second political party in Britain. The Liberal Party was sort of outflanked. They had been the party of the working class, but now the Labour Party offered a somewhat more radical, somewhat more working class focused alternative. And eventually what happened was the Labour Party supplanted the Liberal Party as the other party in British politics. So today the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are the two major parties. The Liberal Party is sort of a fringe third party. But the Labour Party, again, reflecting the fact that they were influenced by utopian socialists, the Labour Party is not militant, but they did believe in things like nationalizing, that is, having the government take control of major industries like, say, coal mines or electrical power production or transportation, things like that, having the government own and operate those in order to promote access in a more equal way to a larger number of people. And that became sort of the standard for the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party of the 1990s, of Tony Blair, was sort of very similar to that of the Democratic Party here in the United States under Bill Clinton, a much more liberal, more centrist party. They weren't out nationalizing things, but for most of the 20th century, that was the stance of the Labour Party. So you can see how the whole debate over how government should respond to the challenges of industrial and urban society affected British politics, how British politics adapted to that. So that by the time we enter into the 20th century, we're looking at a debate, looking at a two-party system, one of which is very much a working person's party. The first Labour Party prime minister was David Lloyd George. He was the prime minister, by the way, during World War I. He promoted the idea of what was called a people's budget. Well, the minute you hear a phrase "people's," you think about socialism. It was a people's budget, a budget that had a lot of the social welfare programs that were being pioneered in Germany by Otto von Bismarck, things like workers' compensation, pension, insurance, things like that. So it was sort of England's first budget that was representative of a new attitude toward taking care of the working class. The working class was increasingly influential in British politics, and it began to show in the policies of the British government. But I want to steer backward. Before we get too far down the road into the 20th century, I want to steer backward toward the empire, because the British had lost their chief colonies in the Americas at the end of the 18th century. During the 19th century, the early part of the 19th century, the focus of British imperial policy was on Ireland. And Ireland had become part of Britain, technically, part of England, or had come under English influence, technically, as early as the reign of King John, who was invited in by one of the Irish sort of clannish kings. And from that point on, there was always a British presence in Ireland, although for the most part it was concentrated just around the city of Dublin. But during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth and then her successor James were determined to sort of subjugate Ireland and make it truly part of the British realm. And as you know, mentioned before, Elizabeth was known for deporting Irish Catholics out of Ireland, and then James, Elizabeth and James, both promoted the idea of colonizing Ireland with English and Scottish colonists. These colonies were known as plantations, and the concept of transplanting English and Scotsmen to Ireland, it was to supplant the Irish Catholic identity. Roman Catholicism was tied up in the Irish identity, the Irish national identity, and the effort was now being made to suppress Catholicism, for one thing, by essentially trying to dilute it, by having more and more English Anglicans and Scottish Presbyterians locate and populate Ireland. During the English Civil War, the Irish Catholics rebelled, and as soon as the English Civil War was over, Oliver Cromwell dispatched himself and the New Model Army to Ireland to suppress the Catholic rebellion, and he was quite forceful in his Irish campaign. He essentially waged total war against the Irish. He burned their crops. He bombarded with artillery their towns and villages. He made war on civilians, and in doing so, reduced the population of Ireland by about half. It was devastating, and from that point on, Ireland was fully subjugated to the British. They continued to create plantations there in an effort to overtake the Catholic population. But in addition to that, the British began to implement laws designed to suppress that Catholic identity, and these were particularly heavily implemented during the first part of the 18th century. Ever since Irish subjugation at the hands of Cromwell, the Irish had looked for occasions to rebel against British rule. They were major supporters and regular supporters of the Jacobite risings. They were the supporters. The first major Jacobite rising or Jacobite rebellion took place in Ireland, and the culminating battle of that, the Battle of the Boyne, was fought in Ireland against William and Mary. William and Mary, Queen Anne, and the Georges, they all fought the Jacobites, and almost all of these Jacobite rebellions were centered on or supported by the Irish Catholics. The response of this, the response of the British government to this then was to impose the penal laws, Penal, penal laws, which were designed to suppress Irish Catholic identity. They prohibited Roman Catholics from purchasing land. They prohibited Roman Catholics from voting for Ireland's Parliament. They obviously then prevented Roman Catholics from serving in Ireland's Parliament, from the army, from teaching school. They prohibited Protestants from converting to they prohibited Roman Catholics from converting to Protestantism. From intermarrying with Protestants. If a Protestant wanted to convert in order to marry a Catholic, he had to give up all his property, and so on. And the penal laws were in place both because of the desire to suppress Irish Catholic nationalism, but also because the Vatican, the Pope, had never recognized the Georges as the legitimate rulers of England. And so as long as that was the case, the Irish people, as Catholics, were sort of forced to reject them as well. And so the penal laws were in place. Gradually, however, as the 18th century wore on, and particularly after the American War of Independence, the British government backed off on a lot of the penal laws, and you see a lot of them being repealed. Obviously, the experience with the American colonists was an eye-opener in a bad way for the British. They realized that attempting to suppress your subjects by force could sometimes backfire on you. So one by one, the penal laws were repealed. And by the turn of the 19th century, most of them had been repealed. The only ones remaining were the ones that prohibited Roman Catholics from serving in Parliament. They could now vote. And there was the hated tithe law, in which all Irish were required to make tithe to the Church of Ireland, which was the local version of the Church of England. That meant that Roman Catholics were being forced to tithe to a church that they did not subscribe to, and of course at the same time they were voluntarily tithing the Roman Catholic Church. So those were the last two penal laws in place, but in 1803, the British Parliament passed a law called the Act of Union, and the Act of Union absorbed Ireland's Parliament into the British Parliament. And on the one hand, you say, okay, Union, that's good. The Irish now have a say in the British government. But in reality, this wasn't good. They no longer had their own parliament, and the number of Irish representatives in the House of Commons was so small that they would be outvoted on anything, so they didn't really have any influence. So the Act of Union was a major step backward, actually, for British-Irish relations. And in the first half of the 19th century, you had an Irish nationalist named Daniel O'Connell who emerged to fight back against the Act of Union. He encouraged instead what was known as Catholic emancipation. That is to say that at the very least, the last of the penal laws ought to be repealed, and in that way Irish Catholics be emancipated from the restrictions that had been put on them by the British government. He formed what was known as the Catholic Association, which encouraged membership amongst all Irish Catholics, and supported his run for Parliament because he noted that the penal law prohibited Irish Catholics for Catholics from serving in Parliament, but not from running for it. And he actually won. And then he presented himself to Parliament and said, look, you're a democracy. I've been duly elected by my people. Are you going to seat me or not? Knowing that if the British could not really legitimately refuse to seat him. And so the British changed the law. They repealed the law, which prohibited Irish Catholics from sitting in Parliament. They didn't want to incite some sort of rebellion amongst the Irish. And Daniel O'Connell took his seat in Parliament. But Daniel O'Connell, it's a good example of the kind of approach, strategy that O'Connell took toward Catholic emancipation and Irish nationalism. O'Connell did not believe in violent uprising. There had been, when he was a young man in his 20s, a violent uprising by a group called the League of United Irishmen, led by Theobald Wolfe-Tone, and they had attempted, with the help of the French, a violent rebellion against the British. It had been suppressed. And O'Connell had instead insisted on sort of nonviolent civil disobedience as his strategy. It's how he got himself seated in Britain's Parliament. It's how he got that penal law repealed. And it's how he then proposed to get the Act of Union repealed through acts of civil disobedience. His fellow citizens, Irish, did not always follow his suggestion. There was a sharp, violent conflict called the Tithe War. The last of the penal laws that remained was that hated tithe. And he proposed, as a strategy of civil disobedience, to simply not pay the tithes. But when the British sort of forcefully sought to collect the tithes, many Irish sort of began to fight back, and so it turned into a violent rebellion, again suppressed. But instead, when pushing for the repeal of the Act of Union, O'Connell proposed, again, a sort of nonviolent approach. He conducted these huge meetings known as monster meetings. And these monster meetings were a lot like what you saw with the Chartists and then the Anti-Coin Law League before them. Huge public demonstrations designed to make a point to the British government. Unfortunately, it just didn't seem to be getting anywhere, and what you began to see was a younger generation of Irish nationalists who were concluding that 20 years of nonviolent civil disobedience was not getting the Irish what they needed fast enough. And so you began to see competing strategies within the Irish nationalist movement. You had the older generation with O'Connell and his nonviolent strategies, a younger generation led by a group called Young Ireland, which was part of the broader Young Europe that was seeking to promote national reform, nationalism and liberalism throughout Europe at that time. Also, Daniel O'Connell died. He was on a pilgrimage in Rome and caught a fever and died. And when he did, the vacuum the power vacuum then opened the door for the more violent, radical Young Ireland to take over the leadership of this movement. And they did. It got really, really ugly in 1846, 47, 48 during what was known as the potato blight. A fungus attacked Ireland's potato crop. It was their chief crop. Prior to that time, Ireland had been really having a very rapidly growing population. They had not only regained their population prior to Cromwell's total war campaigns, but had doubled on their population. It was the fastest growing population in Europe at the time. And then their staple crop, potatoes, was cut out from under them by this blight. So the potato blight and famine. The British were supposed to assist the Irish in recovery from this, but the control of emergency grain was managed by a guy named Sir Charles Trevelyan, who refused to distribute it because he believed that the blight was a sort of a sign from God, a punishment of the Irish by God, because he believed the Irish were wicked. And so this then led to, again, another violent outbreak by Young Ireland. In 1848, when violence was breaking out all across Europe, we have what's known as the Young Irish Disorders. It was again successfully suppressed by the British. Most of the leaders of Young Ireland were captured and deported to Australia, to prison camps, famously the prison colony at Botany Bay in Australia. And it really didn't get anywhere. The focus of the Irish nationalists then shifted to the concept of home rule. They were looking for something that the British could give them that might be a little less radical than independence, a little bit less radical maybe than the repeal of the Act of Union. But under home rule, the Irish would be allowed to have their own parliament again, but that parliament would be limited in its decision-making powers to handling affairs that were unique, sort of domestic to Ireland. They would continue to follow the British Parliament's direction on foreign policy and trade and monetary matters. And indeed, the Home Rule advocates found a supporter in William Gladstone. And as I mentioned, Gladstone, sort of part of the reason for the defeat of the Liberals eventually was the fact that Gladstone was an open supporter of Irish Home Rule at a time when that was not popular. 3 times he proposed Irish Home Rule bills into the British Parliament, and all 3 times they were defeated. And the British, the question of Irish independence continued into the 20th century. Real briefly, we'll just comment on the fact that during World War I, in 1916, with the British very much focused on fighting the Germans, you had 200,000 Irish serving in the British Army, but on the other hand, you also had Irish who believed that this was sort of their chance. And so in Easter of 1916, you have what's known as the Easter Rebellion, or the Easter Rising in Dublin, in which Irish nationalists declared, basically they managed to kick British authorities out of the center of Dublin and declared Ireland's independence. They declared the creation of an independent Irish Republic and the establishment of an Irish Republican army to defend it against the British. The uprising was eventually suppressed again by the British, successfully suppressed, the leaders executed, but the Irish Republican Army did not simply submit defeat this time, and instead continued to work toward home rule and or independence by waging guerrilla warfare and acts of terrorism against British authorities. Finally, after World War I was over in 1922, in a treaty established between Britain and the Irish Republic, most of Ireland became independent, became known as the Irish Free State, or the Republic of Ireland, or IRE. Only the 6 counties in the north which was largely Anglican Presbyterian, where the plantation movement had been strongest, those counties remained, and to this day remain, part of the United Kingdom. But at that time, the southern part of Ireland became its own free, independent state, free, independent republic, again known as the Irish Republic, or the Irish Free State, or IRE, E-I-R-E. Now, that didn't end the violence or the controversy. There were, despite the fact that in the 6 counties up north, they were dominated by Anglicans and Presbyterians, there were Catholics who lived there. There were many in the Irish Free State who wished to continue the operations of the Irish Republican Army, acts of guerrilla warfare and terrorism against British authorities. These people were determined to have all of Ireland be under the control of Ireland and have all of it be freed from British rule. On the other hand, you had very strong feelings among many Anglicans and Presbyterians in Northern Ireland to remain part of Britain. They were called Unionists because they feared how they would be treated if they were sort of absorbed into the Catholic-dominated Irish government. So the reality is that the violence and controversy between the Irish and the British continued well into the 20th century, even after the 1922 treaty that created an independent Irish state. In the meantime, the British were building up an empire beyond the Isles, and it really had a lot to do with economics. There were other reasons as well, but it had a lot to do with economics. As British manufacturing capacity grew, as they became more and more efficient at producing textiles and everything else, really there were two economic concerns. Number one was access to raw materials, because although Britain had a decent supply of coal and iron ore, things like cotton, they had it was not available at all. And so they were always looking for sources of raw materials. And as the industrial era progressed and you needed things like copper for wiring and stuff like that, the British demand for other raw materials that were not native to the British Isles caused them to look outward for that. But then additionally, as they became a much more efficient manufacturing power, as their manufacturing capacity grew more and more efficient, you got to the point where you needed a new market. You needed a new market for all those products. The British home market could not absorb all those products anymore. And so the British were looking outward for that. So there was an economic interest in expanding the empire. There was also political interest in as much as empire building was seen as a sign of national strength and influence, and the pride of the British led them down that road. And then there was also a cultural component. The British really did believe that they had established the most advanced society, and most Western Europeans believed this, that in the adoption of democracy and free market capitalism and Protestant Christianity, the Western Europeans, and especially the British, believed that they had established the pinnacle of human society. And they looked at the rest of the world. They looked at the Africans, the Asians, the Pacific Islanders, and they sort of regarded them as inferior. And there is a part of the British mentality that justifies conquest by presenting it as doing good things for the people whom they conquer. On the one hand, we are taking the resources we need, we're establishing the markets we need, but on the other hand, we're doing something good. So there's this cultural component called paternalism. The British and Western Europeans regarded themselves as like father figures who could raise up these immature societies that have been living in darkness. So it's manifested in a poem by Rudyard Kipling, British poet, called The White Man's Burden, in which he basically argues that the Europeans, and by the way, the Americans, have a moral obligation to go out and conquer these inferior peoples and bring them this more advanced form of civilization. So you've got economic, political, and cultural considerations going into the British impulse to build empire. The British tended to rule their empire differently than the continental Europeans did. The British ruled indirectly. Continental Europeans tended to rule directly. They sent their own people. When they conquered a nation of people in, say, Africa, the Europeans, say the Belgians or the French, they would send their own people in to govern them and to manage the day-to-day affairs. The British, as much as possible, tried to find out who the existing leadership were, the native leadership, and they would try to sort of buy them out with bribes. Technologies like cars, when they came along, access to British education for their children, things like that. And so what happened was, although at the top of the leadership structure in a British colony, say in Asia or Africa, although at the top there was a British viceroy, and his council was largely made up of British people as well, a lot of the day-to-day operations of government were carried out by the native leadership structure. And there were even some native leaders who served in the Viceroy's Council as well. And this was all designed for the British to be more efficient. The British governed India with 800 million people, or whatever it was, with a smaller number of administrative staff, British administrative staff, than it took the Habsburgs to govern their little empire of 20 million people. So it was more efficient, therefore less expensive, but also the British believed it would help to prevent, it would be less likely to incite resentments among the natives whom they had conquered, and so they wouldn't be constantly dealing with uprisings. I will say that in the long run, it was beneficial. If you were going to suffer under the control of European domination, it was better to be ruled by the British, because then, when the time for independence finally came, you had experience with governing and administering your society, and so a lot of those former British colonies did a lot better when they became independent than, say, a former French or Belgian or Italian colony. They had the experience of day-to-day government. The British were interested in Africa. They had helped to build the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. They had huge interests in the cotton that was growing in the Nile River Valley. And so the British had essentially established a protectorate in Egypt. They fought to defend and protect those assets. You have an uprising in the Sudan, and the British will go into the Sudan and demonstrate the superiority of British technology at the Battle of Omdurman, a battle in which British artillery and machine guns just wiped out thousands and thousands of native soldiers. This was generally true, that prior to the advent of these kinds of technologies, the Europeans could not really penetrate Africa. Native armies were well organized, and they had firearms. They had acquired them through the slave trade. But the machine gun, on the other hand, was a weapon which turned the tide. And the establishment of quinine, which gave Europeans a temporary protection from malaria if dosed properly, also helped to turn the tide in Africa in favor of the invading Europeans. The British also took interest in South Africa, and there they had to contend not only with native Africans, primarily the Zulus, but also with the Dutch settlers who had established themselves there already, the Afrikaners, or Boers, as the British called them. The Afrikaners had established their colony in South Africa and had established extensive agriculture there, plantations that were staffed primarily by slaves, native African slaves, who had been defeated in battle by the Zulus and then sold to the Dutch. When the British moved in, they largely left this operation alone, but then when the British government, which is part of their reforms in the 1830s, when the British government abolished slavery, that cut the whole labor system of the Afrikaners right out from under them. And the Afrikaners picked up and moved north in an effort to get away from the British authorities in the southernmost part of South Africa. They attempted to move north. And there they discovered diamonds. And so the British followed them. And in the end, you have a whole series of wars. First, the British will fight the Zulus for control of the northern part of South Africa. They suffer a couple nasty defeats initially, but then they bring in the technology and the reinforcements. They defeat the Zulus. And then they have to fight the Boers. And these are wars called the Boer Wars. The Boers, the Dutch, the Afrikaners, they will fight a sort of exhausting guerrilla warfare against the British. And in the end, although the British technically won, they got sort of worn down, and they signed a treaty with the Boers. They reached an agreement with the Boers in which, although South Africa continued to be part of the British Empire, the Boers essentially had home rule. They became the rulers of South Africa on the internal matters. It was kind of like what the Irish were looking for in home rule, control over internal matters, and then being part of the British Empire and subject to British Parliament, all things external. The Boers then established, with their internal rule, they established what was called apartheid, which was a series of policies designed to subjugate the native African population almost back to the level of slavery. They couldn't have slavery, but as close to it as possible. The British then proceeded to try to acquire a corridor in between Egypt in the north and South Africa in the south. with the vision of building a railroad that would be called the Cape to Cairo Railroad. This brought them into conflict with the French, and indeed there was a great fear among some in Europe, particularly Germany's Otto von Bismarck, that competition, this sort of crazy competition for empire, would eventually lead to a general war in Europe, and it almost led to war between the British and the French, who confronted each other at Fashoda in the Sudan. And it looked for a time like it would lead to war between Britain and France. In the end, the French backed down. But the Fashoda crisis pointed out the danger of European countries who were in this crazy competition for resources in Africa. The British were also in India, had been, going back into the 1600s. They had sort of displaced the Portuguese. The Portuguese had established the first European interests in India. But the British, using their fleet and their excellent diplomacy, had negotiated exclusive trading rights with the Mughal emperor and with many of the native Indian Rajas of southern Africa. Raja is a king. And after fighting it out with the French for most of the 18th century for control of Indian trade, by the 19th century, the British had pretty much eliminated all of their European competitors, and they were dealing directly with the Indian Rajas. However, in 1857, there was a sharp rebellion against the British East India Company. The British East India Company really ruled India. The British government didn't. The British East India Company, the British government certainly always acted on behalf of the company, providing security and support and diplomatic influence. But the East India Company itself was running the show. They hired lots of native Indian soldiers to essentially work private security to protect their investments. But in 1857, these sepoys rebelled against them over the issue of whether they had been issued guns whose cartridges were lubricated with animal fat, the fat of cows, the fat of pigs. Cows are sacred to Hindus, pigs are dirty, filthy to Muslims, and these cartridges you had to bite off. You had to bite off the paper wrapping, and when it was rumored that these cartridges were lubricated with pig fat or cow fat, the sepoys refused to use them. They are then put in jail, they mutiny, there's a nasty rebellion, and both sides do pretty awful things. But eventually the British sent in troops, and they managed to suppress the sepoys. At that point, the British East India Company was told by the British government, you screwed this up. And now the British government increasingly took on more of a role in governing India. It was indirect rule. The British entered into negotiations and sort of bought out the loyalties of the native leaders of India. And this was known as the Raj. The arrangement was known as the Raj, R-A-J. And the British Raj continued to rule India from 1857 until 1947, basically. They invested enormous amounts. The British invested enormous amounts of money into India. They built railroads, they built port facilities, they built hospitals and schools and government facilities. India definitely benefited in some ways. Their infrastructure there were more miles of railroad built in India than in continental Europe by the British. But it was all meant to export Britain or India's resources out in a form of neo-mercantilism. All of the system was designed to more efficiently transfer wealth from India to Britain. And that did eventually spark an Indian nationalist movement, the creation of what was known as the Indian National Congress. This was Mohandas Gandhi's party, and eventually in the 20th century, this is the party under his leadership that will take on the strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience, that of Daniel O'Connell, and push to eventually achieve Indian independence. I would mention also the British role in China. The British were very interested as early as the early 1800s trading with Chinese. China, for the most part, ruled by the Qing dynasty, didn't believe that the British had anything that was worth trading for. It was a sort of a view of cultural superiority. But eventually, the Qing relented and they allowed a minimal amount of trade by the British in and out of China. But the British couldn't find any products that the Chinese wanted, so they were forced to trade only gold and silver. That was the only thing that the Chinese would trade for. So the British had a problem. There was a very unfavorable balance of trade for them, And they finally stumbled upon opium as an alternative, opium which they were growing in India. And opium had been used by British citizens who were suffering from painful diseases like tuberculosis and gout. And on the other hand, some British had learned how to use it recreationally. But the British began trading that. The British under Queen Victoria began trading that. And Queen Victoria was the ruler who is most closely associated with the expansion of the British Empire. Queen Victoria ruled for 2/3 of the 19th century, and therefore oversaw this great expansion to the point where people used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire because it was so far-flung all around the globe. But anyway, Queen Victoria approved the introduction of opium into China, and suddenly that took off, and that became the product that the Chinese were willing to trade their goods for. It got to a point where it's thought maybe 1 in 5 Chinese were addicted to the stuff, and finally the emperor begged the British to stop. When they didn't do it, they deliberately destroyed casks of opium on the wharves, and that initiated what were known as the Opium Wars, in which the British, with their superior naval technologies, defeated the Chinese and forced the Chinese to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which basically opened all of China's ports to the British. This was bad news for the Chinese because eventually a lot of the other European countries and also the United States demanded access to their ports. And very soon, Chinese ports began to look very strange. They were very much foreign places with enormous amount of foreign influence, a lot of influence they didn't like. Chinese nationalists didn't like Christianity, among other things, because not only did were these ports open to sailors and merchants and some of their worse habits like drunkenness and prostitution, but also they were open to missionaries, and many of these missionaries were in the process of converting Chinese to Christianity. And so a group of Chinese nationalists called the Society of the Fists of Righteous Harmony, or the Society of Righteous Harmonious Fists, fist being a symbol of unity, staged a rebellion. It was known as the Boxer Rebellion because of their symbol as a fist. The British referred to them as the Boxers, and the Americans referred to them that way too. It was a nationalist rebellion that was particularly targeting the Chinese or the Christian missionaries, and even more so targeting Chinese who had converted to Christianity. And probably 20,000 Chinese Christians were killed, several hundred Western missionaries were killed before a multinational European, American, Japanese army went in and crushed the rebellion on behalf of the Qing dynasty. But the Qing dynasty was on its way out. It was gone within 10 years after this. But it demonstrates the influence that the British had come to have all over the world. In India, in China, in Africa, in Ireland, and elsewhere. One thing that is maybe also worth mentioning before we leave Britain, and this leads us right up to World War I, because Britain's interest in maintaining its colonies was threatened by Germany when they began their great naval buildup, and that contributed to tension between those countries, which contributed to World War I. But one more thing I would mention is that in British politics, at the time of World War I, was now undergoing the influence of a feminist movement. As the British had been steadily expanding the suffrage, moving toward universal male suffrage, women began to question why there was no opportunity for them to earn the suffrage as well. And a movement known as the suffragist movement was established by Emmeline Pankhurst. She founded an organization called the Women's Social and Political Union, and the purpose of the Women's Social and Political Union was to push the British government to extend this suffrage movement, this expansion of suffrage, to include women. There was a debate among women over whether their mission was, whether their goal should be to have all women receive suffrage immediately, a more radical goal that would be harder to achieve but more satisfying, or whether they should consider a more stepped approach, like maybe having suffrage for single women or suffrage for women over a certain age, and then hope that they could parlay that later into universal female suffrage. So there was a debate there, but generally speaking, the debate over the goal was not as important as the debate over strategy. And originally, the strategy of the women was to, in the suffragist movement, was to petition Parliament, to work with the Liberal Party, to work with the Labour Party. And in the end, none of this seemed to be working. So they did shift toward a more radical strategy, a strategy of violent but not violence against people. They vandalized the houses of members of Parliament who had opposed women's suffrage. They lit mailboxes on fire, that sort of thing. And then, interestingly, when they were arrested, they went on hunger strikes while in prison. And it's interesting, the images of British authorities force-feeding women in prison actually did more to help their cause, it was the reaction against that, than some of the acts of vandalism had. But what's interesting is it's what Pankhurst chose not to do, or what she chose to back off. When World War I came along, she announced that there would be a cessation in the hostile actions of the Women's Social and Political Union. They had come to be known as suffragettes. They called themselves suffragists. Their critics who didn't like their more radical actions called them suffragettes. But she announced that whether you called them suffragists or suffragettes, they would back fully the British government's war effort. And that gained a lot of goodwill for the movement, along with the negative publicity that the government suffered from force-feeding the women in prison. So that after the war, women over the age of 30 did receive the right to vote. And later on, that was expanded to all women. So the feminist movement, which started in Britain and the United States, achieved its first victory in Europe in Britain. And then gradually the movement to extend the rights, the voting rights to women, was expanded through Western Europe. One of the last countries to do that was France, following World War II. So that's about it for the British. 2 big, long review sessions which take Britain from the end of the medieval era and the beginning of the modern era all the way up to World War I. And our next podcast will focus on France during that era.